They thought they were clever because they were whispering where they thought you couldn't hear. Little meetings, private conversations, carefully chosen words, that smug little confidence people get when they believe they've hidden the truth behind closed doors. Cute. They forgot something important. Secrecy doesn't make a plan invisible. Sometimes people reveal more by the way they behave than by what they actually say. A sudden change in attitude, strange questions, unexplained distance, nervous reactions when you walk into the room. Funny how the truth leaves fingerprints everywhere, and you were watching, not panicking, not confronting, watching. Because when people think you know nothing, they become careless. They stop protecting the details. They talk too freely. They start believing their own story. Meanwhile, you're sitting there collecting patterns instead of emotions, noticing who suddenly knows too much, who asks questions they shouldn't be asking, who changes their behavior depending on who's standing nearby. That's where the game gets interesting. You don't need to expose every secret the moment you discover it. Sometimes silence gives you more information than confrontation ever could. Let people continue believing their little performance is working. Let them reveal the structure of the plan through their own behavior. You don't have to announce that you've noticed the cracks. And here's the part they never understand. Awareness doesn't always, it looks like staring calm. Sometimes it looks like asking one simple question and listening carefully for the answer. Sometimes it means saying nothing at all while somebody accidentally tells you exactly what you needed to know. They thought they were moving pieces around you. They didn't realize you were paying attention to the board. But don't become obsessive around if you whisper. Why is it whisper? Say you as a whisper. Not every strange look is a conspiracy, and not every private conversation is about you. Real strength is knowing the difference between evidence and imagination. You don't need paranoia when observation is enough. You don't need revenge when clarity already gives you the advantage. So let them underestimate you. Let them assume you're distracted. Let them believe you're still reacting emotionally to everything. Meanwhile, keep your eyes open, keep your standards sharp, and keep your mouth disciplined. Because sometimes the person who knows the least says the most, while the person who understands the situation simply watches the pieces move, recognizes the patterns, and waits without revealing exactly how much they've already noticed. They thought your silence meant you were clueless, which is almost adorable when you think about it. They looked at you, saw someone who wasn't reacting, wasn't asking 100 questions, wasn't running around demanding explanations, and decided you must not know anything. That's the mistake people make when they confuse silence with ignorance. Sometimes silence means you're thinking. Sometimes it means you're observing. Sometimes it means you've already noticed enough to understand that reacting too early would only give away what you know. You don't have to announce every thought that crosses your mind. You don't have to tell everyone what you've discovered. In fact, sometimes the less you say, the more people reveal. People become careless around someone they underestimate. They stop choosing their words carefully. They repeat themselves. They contradict earlier stories. They mention details they shouldn't know. They ask questions that reveal what they're really interested in. And suddenly the person they thought was sitting there clueless is actually sitting there connecting dots. That's why you shouldn't feel pressured to respond immediately whenever something seems strange. Take a breath. Observe. Ask yourself what you actually know and what you're only assuming. There's a difference, and that difference matters. You don't want to become so suspicious that every conversation looks like a secret operation. That's not awareness. That's anxiety wearing a detective costume. Real awareness stays grounded. It watches what can be verified. It notices repeated behavior. It waits for patterns instead of building conclusions from one weird moment. And when the pattern becomes obvious, you don't need to make a dramatic announcement. You can simply adjust your behavior. Maybe you stop sharing certain information. Maybe you become more selective about who gets access to your plans. Maybe you stop explaining yourself to people who repeatedly twist your words. Maybe you create some distance without giving a 10-page explanation. That's not playing games. That's understanding that trust is something people demonstrate, not something they receive automatically. The people who underestimated your silence may eventually wonder why you suddenly became more careful. Let them wonder. You don't owe everyone a map of your thinking. Sometimes they only notice the change because they were used to having unlimited access to you. They knew what you were planning, what you were worried about, what you were hoping for, and how you reacted under pressure. Then you learned to keep certain things private. Suddenly their information supply disappeared, and now they have to guess. That's when you realize how much power you gave away simply by explaining too much. You don't need to become secretive about everything. You just need to understand that privacy is not deception. You are allowed to keep your plans quiet until they're ready. You're allowed to observe before responding. You're allowed to change your mind after receiving new information. You're allowed to protect your attention from people who consistently misuse it. And when someone finally realizes that your silence wasn't ignorance at all, but patience, discipline, and observation, the funniest part is that you won't need to celebrate the realization, because by then you'll already be focused on what matters next, calmly watching what people do rather than desperately reacting to what they say, while the ones who underestimated you slowly discover that the quiet person in the room may have noticed far more than they ever imagined. Words are easy. Anyone can arrange a few of them into a convincing story, especially when they know exactly what you want to hear. I had nothing to do with it. You misunderstood. I was only trying to help. Beautiful. Almost poetic. But then there's behavior, that annoying little thing people forget about when they're busy constructing explanations. Behavior leaves clues. Timing leaves clues. Repeated patterns leave clues. And once you stop listening only to what people say and start watching what they consistently do, the whole picture becomes much harder to manipulate. Someone can tell you they support you, but watch what happens when you start succeeding. Do they celebrate you, or suddenly become distant? Someone can claim they're happy for you, but notice how often they ask questions that seem designed to uncover your weaknesses. Someone can insist they respect your boundaries, then repeatedly test those boundaries the moment you stop giving them what they want. That's information. Not proof of some grand secret plot, but information worth noticing. The trick is not becoming paranoid. That's too easy. Anyone can look at every strange event and invent a conspiracy around it. Real awareness is much more boring, much more disciplined, and much more useful. You collect facts, you compare behavior, you notice what repeats. You don't let one awkward conversation become a complete story in your head. You don't accuse people because of a feeling. You wait until their actions create a pattern strong enough to understand. And patterns have a funny habit of exposing people who thought they were being careful. They forget what they told you last week. They behave differently around different people. They suddenly become interested in information that shouldn't matter to them. They ask questions that sound innocent until you remember what happened before. Individually, each moment might mean nothing. Together, they can tell you something important. That's why observation is more powerful than immediate confrontation. If you confront someone too early, they get the opportunity to change the story. Suddenly you're arguing about what happened instead of watching what happens next. But if you stay calm, you can learn more. You can see whether their behavior changes when they think you're watching. You can see whether their explanation remains consistent. You can see whether their actions match their promises. That's not manipulation. That's simply refusing to ignore what your own eyes are showing you. And here's the part people don't expect. You don't have to expose every contradiction you notice. Sometimes knowing is enough. You can quietly change what you share. You can stop giving sensitive information to someone who has demonstrated they don't handle it responsibly. You can keep your plans private until they're ready. You can create distance without turning your life into a courtroom drama. Because the goal isn't to catch people in a trap. The goal is to protect yourself from repeating the same mistake. When you learn to watch patterns instead of chasing explanations, you stop being so easily distracted by charming words and emotional performances. You start asking a simpler question. What does this person consistently do? And that question cuts through an incredible amount of nonsense because people can control a sentence, they can polish an apology, they can rehearse a story, but maintaining a false pattern forever is much harder. And eventually the behavior begins speaking so loudly that you don't need anyone to confess what you already learned from watching carefully, patiently, and without allowing suspicion to become the thing controlling your mind. There's a moment when you discover something that changes the entire way you look at a situation, and the first instinct is usually to react, to confront, to demand answers, to make sure everyone knows you figured it out. And that's exactly where people lose their advantage. Because the second your emotions take the wheel, everyone suddenly knows what you know, what you fear, what bothered you, and what you're planning to do next. Congratulations. You just handed them the instruction manual for your reaction. Staying calm isn't weakness. It's refusing to give away information for free. When you notice something strange, breathe. Look again. Separate what you actually know from what you think you know. That's important because your mind can become a wonderful little theater when fear gets involved. One strange message becomes a secret plan. One awkward conversation becomes a conspiracy. One person looking at you differently suddenly means everybody is plotting behind your back. Relax. Reality doesn't need your imagination to make it dramatic. Look for evidence. Look for repetition. Look for behavior that can actually be observed. If something is real, patience won't make it disappear. In fact, patience often makes the truth easier to see. People reveal themselves when they don't feel pressured. They continue their normal habits. They forget what they've said. They repeat the same patterns. They become careless. And while they're busy assuming you're unaware, you're simply paying attention. That's the difference between reacting and observing. Reacting says, I need an answer right now. Observing says, let me see what happens next. One creates noise. The other creates information. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone expects an emotional explosion is absolutely nothing. Not because you're afraid to speak, but because you understand that silence gives you time to choose the right response instead of the fastest one. You don't have to confront every suspicious behavior. You don't have to accuse someone just because something feels wrong. You don't have to turn your life into a courtroom where every conversation becomes evidence. You can simply become more careful, share less, listen more, protect your plans. Watch who respects your boundaries when you stop giving them what they want. Watch who becomes angry when you ask reasonable questions. Watch who suddenly changes their behavior when they realize you're paying attention. Those reactions can tell you more than 100 explanations. And if you eventually discover that your suspicion was wrong, good. You learned something without destroying a relationship through an accusation based on imagination. If your concerns were justified, good. Now you have clarity without having created unnecessary chaos. Either way, composure protects you. That's the real power. Not intimidating people, not making threats, not trying to appear dangerous, just having enough control over yourself that nobody else gets to choose your emotional response for you. Let them wonder what you're thinking. Let them underestimate how carefully you're watching. You don't need to reveal every card just because someone asks to see your hand. Sometimes you already have enough information to make a better decision, and the smartest move isn't exposing what you discovered, but quietly changing your position, protecting your peace, and allowing other people's behavior to reveal the truth without you having to force it out of them, while you remain calm enough to notice what happens next, instead of becoming so desperate for immediate answers that you accidentally reveal everything you were trying to protect. Let them reveal themselves. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But people have this adorable habit of ruining their own plans when nobody interrupts them. They talk too much. They repeat themselves. They contradict yesterday's version of the story. They become confident when they think you're unaware, and suddenly careless when they believe they have everything under control. That's why you don't always need to expose what you know. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is step back and watch. Not with paranoia. Not with some ridiculous fantasy that everyone around you is secretly plotting. Just with enough awareness to notice patterns before you decide what they mean. When you confront someone too quickly, you give them an opportunity to prepare. They can change their explanation. They can delete context. They can suddenly become extremely innocent. I would never. Wonderful performance. But when you stay calm, you allow behavior to continue naturally, and natural behavior tells you far more than a pressured confession ever could. Watch what happens when you stop providing information. Watch who starts asking unnecessary questions. Watch who suddenly becomes interested in your plans. Watch who gets irritated because you aren't responding the way they expected. Watch who respects your privacy and who treats your boundaries like an invitation to push harder. Those reactions matter. They don't automatically prove someone's intentions, but they give you information about how people respond when they don't have the access they once enjoyed. And that's where you need to become selective. You don't have to punish anyone. You don't have to create enemies. You don't have to walk around announcing that you've discovered something. Sometimes you simply reduce access. You stop sharing every detail. You keep your next move private. You let people earn trust instead of receiving unlimited trust because of history. That's maturity. And here's something people rarely understand. Privacy is not dishonesty. You are allowed to have thoughts you don't share. You're allowed to have plans nobody knows about. You're allowed to take your time before answering a question. You're allowed to say, "I don't want to discuss that." You don't owe everyone a backstage pass to your life. If someone becomes angry because you created a reasonable boundary, pay attention to that reaction. A healthy person may be disappointed, but they can still respect your decision. A controlling person often treats your boundary like a personal attack. That's useful information. And if someone keeps revealing themselves through repeated behavior, you don't need to force a confession. Their actions are already answering the question. That's the beauty of patience. You stop chasing certainty from people who benefit from keeping you confused. You stop demanding that someone admit what their behavior has already demonstrated. You simply adjust your decisions according to what you observe. If they prove trustworthy, trust can grow. If they repeatedly demonstrate the opposite, distance can grow. No dramatic announcement required, no revenge speech, no theatrical confrontation, just consequences. And sometimes the most satisfying consequence is simply losing access to someone who has finally learned to protect their own peace. Let people wonder why you're quieter. Let them wonder why you stopped explaining. Let them wonder why they don't know your plans anymore. You don't have to solve their curiosity. They created the distance through their behavior, and you are simply responding to what you've learned while you continue observing without becoming consumed by suspicion, allowing consistency, time, and repeated actions to separate genuine people from performances, because eventually people reveal who they are not through one dramatic confession, but through the little choices they keep making when they believe nobody is paying attention. And you can learn everything you need to know without ever announcing that you were watching closely. All along, awareness is powerful. But paranoia is a trap, and there's a very thin line between the two when you've been disappointed by people before. You start noticing everything. A strange look becomes suspicious. A delayed reply becomes evidence. Someone whispering across the room suddenly feels like a secret meeting about you. Congratulations, your imagination just got promoted to detective. But real awareness doesn't work like that. Real awareness doesn't need to invent enemies. It doesn't need to turn every coincidence into a conspiracy. It stays grounded in what can actually be observed. Because if you start believing every suspicion without evidence, you're not becoming harder to deceive. You're simply becoming easier to control through fear. That's why you have to learn the difference between noticing something and deciding what it means. You can notice that someone's behavior changed without immediately deciding they're against you. You can recognize inconsistency without creating an entire story around it. You can feel uncomfortable without treating the feeling as proof. Your instincts can tell you to pay attention, but they shouldn't automatically write the entire conclusion. That's where discipline comes in. You observe, you verify, you wait. You compare what someone says with what they repeatedly do. You look for patterns instead of isolated moments. And if the pattern isn't there, you let it go. That's strength too. Not every mystery needs to become your mission. Not every strange conversation deserves hours of analysis. Sometimes people are distracted. Sometimes they're having a bad day. Sometimes you simply misunderstood the situation. Being able to admit that doesn't make you weak. It makes you mentally flexible. You don't need to be right about every suspicion. You need to be wise about what you do with uncertainty. And when the evidence is real, you don't need to panic either. You can respond calmly. You can create boundaries. You can stop sharing information with someone who repeatedly misuses it. You can distance yourself from unhealthy situations. You can ask direct questions when appropriate. You can protect yourself without turning your life into a battlefield. That's the balance. Strong enough to notice, calm enough to verify, disciplined enough to respond instead of react. Because the goal isn't to walk around thinking everyone is secretly against you. That's miserable. The goal is to become someone who can trust intelligently. You don't give unlimited access just because someone smiles at you. You don't assume everyone is dangerous because one person betrayed you. You allow people to demonstrate who they are over time. That's a much safer way to live. And once you learn that balance, your mind becomes quieter. You stop wasting energy decoding every little movement around you. You stop obsessing over what people might be saying. You focus on what you actually control: your decisions, your boundaries, your attention, your behavior, your future. If someone genuinely respects you, their actions will eventually show it. If someone consistently violates your trust, their actions will show that too. You don't need to force either outcome. Let time reveal what your emotions cannot see clearly in the moment. Let consistency become your evidence. Let reality, not fear, determine your conclusions. And when you discover that someone truly isn't trustworthy, you don't need revenge. You don't need to expose them to the entire world. You simply remove access and continue living. That's the real advantage of awareness. Not knowing every secret, not predicting every betrayal, not becoming obsessed with what everyone else is doing, but knowing when to pay attention, when to wait, when to ask questions, when to step back, and when to protect your peace without allowing suspicion to become the thing that controls your life. Because the strongest mind isn't the one that sees enemies everywhere. It's the one that can see clearly enough to recognize reality without adding unnecessary fear to it. Keeping its eyes open while refusing to let imagination become the author of every story around it, and moving forward with enough wisdom to know that sometimes the truth needs investigation, sometimes it needs patience, and sometimes it simply reveals itself through what people repeatedly choose to do when they believe nobody is watching.